Farmax Red Meat and Farmax Dairy have a few different greenhouse gas reports that farmers and rural professionals can use to better understand the greenhouse gas emission profile for a particular farm. If we look on this farm, we've got our main greenhouse gas report here, which actually exists at multiple different levels within Farmax. So for this particular farm, I can see that the CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions are about 3.66 tonne per total hectare. But I can also view this report at a couple of different levels. So if I go to my sheep enterprise, for example, and look at greenhouse gas, I can see that my sheep enterprise is contributing about 2.88 tonne of CO2 equivalent per total hectare. And if I want to dig in a little further, I can see that my mixed lamb mob is contributing about 0.39 tonne of CO2 equivalent per total hectare. So many of these greenhouse gas reports are available at different levels in Farmax, depending on what you're wanting to drill into. And they can also be filtered by various different areas. So at the moment, I'm looking at my CO2 equivalents per total hectare. I might also be interested in looking just per farm hectare, which will spread my greenhouse gas emissions just purely across the pasture blocks. So if I go per farm hectare, that lifts our emissions to about 4.5 tonne per hectare, because this particular farm has 650 hectares of pasture, but we also have a 150 hectare forestry block. Within this forestry block, you can see that I've got 150 hectares of natives or indigenous forest that was planted in 2005. And that particular block is obviously going to be sequestering quite a bit of carbon, which I can see in the sequestration report for that forestry block. So this shows me the cumulative carbon that's likely to be sequestered over time on this particular block. The data in here is all sourced from MPI's lookup tables, and that actually flows through to one of our other carbon reports here in Farmax. So if I go back up to the top level and have a look at my carbon balance report, you'll see that I get this nice waterfall chart of the various emissions that are coming from stock and fertilizer. That's what's showing up here with methane and nitrous oxide. And I can see that my forestry block is offsetting quite a bit of those emissions. So the total emissions is about 3.66 tonne. We sequester about 2.38 tonne, and that gives us a net amount of about 1.277 tonne of CO2 equivalents per hectare. Now, since Farmax captures quite a few aspects of the farm system, I can also see some of my different efficiency metrics for this particular farm. So the net emissions, for example, for this property are 4.8 kilos of CO2 equivalent for every kilogram of product produced. In this case, meat, wool, and velvet. In the dairy version of Farmax, that would be CO2 equivalents produced for every kilogram of milk solids. And finally, the newest greenhouse gas report that's been added to Farmax is carbon pricing. This is to help farmers and rural professionals start to get an understanding about the financial implications of their greenhouse gas emissions and any carbon sequestered on the farm. So in the case of this particular farm, our gross emissions are about 2,927 total tons of CO2 equivalent. We have that big block of natives on this particular farm, which is sequestering about 1,900 tonne of CO2 equivalents in total across the full farm. And this is some of the financial implications of those two different numbers. With a range of different potential carbon prices, we can see that our carbon credit income is going to vary quite a bit depending on what that price does. And in the second section here, we can see the potential carbon liability from the gross emissions from stock and fertilizer and so on. Again, we get a range of different carbon prices. The carbon prices shown in this table can actually be edited. So I can come up to options, set carbon prices, and put in my own range of different carbon price values to see how that changes the financials. And we also have a range of different cost-free allocations, depending on how much of a discount on that carbon liability that farmers are able to get. And finally, we have essentially just one number minus the other. So if we take our $80 carbon, for example, with a 95% cost-free allocation, we have $152,000 in carbon credit income. We have a carbon liability of about $11,700, which leaves us a sort of net liability, all things considered, of negative $140,700, which means the farm is going to be about $140,000 better off because the carbon credits well exceed the carbon liability for this particular property. Farmax also gives farmers the ability to drill into the source of their emissions. So if I go to the greenhouse gas report, this shows me a good summary of the overall emissions for the full property, but I can also look into breakdown and see how much is coming from methane versus nitrous oxide versus urea hydrolysis, which you would see if you had any nitrogen applications, which we don't have on this farm at the moment. I can also check out by source, which will show me how much is coming from sheep or beef or deer or fertilizer. In this case, we have sheep and beef on the farm, but we don't have any deer and we don't currently use any nitrogen. And finally, I can also see by pathway, which will show me the different biological sources of my greenhouse gas emissions, as well as how much is coming from urea hydrolysis from those fertilizer applications in the form of CO2.